Welcome to the Live Label Free podcast. I'm your host, Livia Sara, an autistic eating disorder recovery coach that's here to help you turn your mess into your message. You can find my books, blogs, courses, coaching, and much more at livelabelfree.com. So that's L-I-V, labelfree.com. And now, let's dive into today's episode. Okay, my friends, we need to talk about something that I literally have never heard anyone talk about, but at this point, it comes up with almost every one of my clients because almost every one of my clients isn't only autistic, but is also ADHD. So what we're going to be talking about today is the connection between ADHD and anorexia. And I am super excited to finally be diving deep into this connection because most of the information on neurodivergence and eating disorders is still quite binary. Supposedly, autism is linked to anorexia and ARFID, which stands for avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, while ADHD is linked to binge eating and compulsive overeating. And while, of course, these links are valid and true, where is the nuance? Why is no one talking about how autistic people struggle with binge eating or how ADHDers struggle with restrictive eating disorders? Well, I've already done a whole series on autism and binge eating on this podcast, so now I'm starting a series on how those of us who are autistic and ADHD interact with food and movement. In this first episode specifically, I'm unpacking the overlooked connection between autism, ADHD, and anorexia through both scientific research and lived experience as an ADHDer with a history of anorexia nervosa. We'll explore how core anorexia symptoms like restriction, compulsive exercise, and mental hunger can be better understood through the ADHD lens and what this understanding means for more effective approaches to recovery, or if you've been around here for longer than a minute, I should probably say discovery. And whatever term you prefer to use though, let's get to discovering. Before we get into any of the specific ADHD and anorexia overlaps, we need to bust a common myth about dopamine, because many people believe that dopamine floods our brain when we engage in rewarding activities. I mean, this is why ADHD people are constantly seeking stimulation, right? Because they constantly want to experience reward? Well, not quite, my friend. In reality, dopamine isn't primarily responsible for pleasure or satisfaction. Rather, it's at the foundation of anticipation and motivation. What this means is that a dopamine surge happens not when we experience the reward itself, but during the anticipation phase right before we obtain it. This wanting versus liking distinction is critical to understanding both ADHD and eating disorders. In ADHD brains, and autistic brains too, dopamine is lower when compared to neurotypical brains, which obviously creates a specific vulnerability. Us ADHD folks experience intensified wanting but a diminished liking of the actual reward, which creates a perpetual cycle of seeking satisfaction without ever feeling satisfied. This is why so many ADHD people do experience binge eating and compulsive overeating, because in these cases, you're constantly wanting the food to stimulate you in a way that your brain and nervous system are never satisfied with. So that's the binge eating angle, of course. But again, why is no one talking about the dopamine high, that euphoria that you get from engaging with anorexia or bulimia? Why is no one talking about how addictive restriction is? how the anorexia is never satisfied, and so you keep setting new precedents around food and exercise. Because I don't know about you, but for me, the eating disorder made me feel superhuman. I was able to numb out everything that didn't directly support the eating disorder, including the existential questions, my relationships, and, well, everything else that makes life meaningful. So, I am going to elaborate on all of this later in this episode and series because right now I really want to emphasize this concept of numbing and how it applies to the full spectrum of disordered eating behaviors, which I have termed the adaptive eating spectrum. So, even though anorexia nervosa and binge eating disorder seem like the epitome of contradiction, the underlying mechanisms, especially in neurodivergent people, aren't actually different. Whether someone restricts food or eats too much of it, the root of the behavior is to numb and escape. It's an escape from sitting with the discomfort of being a soul so infinite, so vast, so boundless that being in a human body feels like being trapped in a cage. The eating disorder, or as many of you know at this point, I like to call it eating adaptation, is a way to numb yourself from the existential thoughts, the fear of being wrong in this world, and the perpetual anxiety that arises as a direct result of navigating a world that wasn't built for your neurodivergent nervous system. Now, if you've been around for a while, you know that I have talked plenty about how I believe my autism manifested as an eating disorder, or again, eating adaptation. My need for predictability turned into strict eating schedules and rigid exercise routines. My sensory overwhelm turned into fear of weight gain. My fear of being healthy, and more specifically, being healthy in a female body, and we're talking boobs, butts, and periods, manifested as trying to stay as small as possible in every sense of the word. It hasn't been until more recently, due to, being a lifelong learner, being relentlessly curious, and constantly asking why, that I've started reflecting on eating disorder behaviors through an ADHD lens. And major shout out to all of my clients right now because none of these insights I am sharing would have occurred to me without the meaningful conversations I've had and continue to have with other neurodivergent beings. And it's worth disclaiming here that my personal experience of anorexia in relationship to both ADHD and autism will always be skewed because I'm not purely ADHD or purely autistic. I'm ADHD, which means the autism and ADHD are interlinked, and it's this interlinking that creates the unique conditions for my experience of, well, everything, including my history of disordered eating. And I am planning on recording a dedicated episode about how my autism and ADHD are constantly battling each other, which obviously creates its own set of difficulties, eating disorders aside. But obviously, that's a story for another day. So, back to the main topic of today, which is ADHD and anorexia. In fact, now it's time to get juicy because we're starting off with the infamous claim, but restriction helps me focus. The reason I'm starting with this restriction and focus aspect of the ADHD anorexia connection is because I've done an entire episode and blog post with this title on the Live Label Free podcast before, so I definitely encourage you to listen to that episode if this is a topic you resonate with. But what exactly do autistic and ADHD people with eating adaptations mean when they say restriction helps them focus? How can this even be true? Doesn't everyone say that eating more and recovering will improve your focus? Well, to answer all of those questions, we need to start by debunking the belief that this statement is used to lie or manipulate. because I'm sure we're all familiar with this idea that weight gain is a top priority when someone is malnourished because a malnourished brain equals a brain that cannot think clearly, right? Well, this understanding lies at the root of why so many people with anorexia who aren't autistic may display autistic traits. Not because their anorexia has caused autism or they are now becoming autistic, but because the brain simply does not have enough energy to process information that it doesn't deem necessary for survival. And I do explain this energy trade off in both my book, How to Beat Extreme Hunger, and in my episode on black and white thinking, so do go listen to that episode as well if you haven't already. And for your convenience, I will leave all the links in the show notes, as always. But in short, because the brain does not have adequate energy to consider a vast array of options, it narrows its focus to what can be easily grasped. Enter the ability to hyperfocus on meal plans, calorie counts, exercise routines, and watching what I eat in a day videos, but getting a full-blown panic attack when your mom can't read your mind of how many almonds you always put on your oatmeal when you test her to make sure she still loves you. Because hello, codependency, which is a whole nother topic. And if you want to read more about my experience with this, go do yourself a favor and also grab a copy of my book, Rainbow Girl. Now, it's worth clarifying that just because a malnourished brain mimics an autistic brain in many ways, this obviously does not mean that an autistic brain is inherently a malnourished one. And yes, I am well aware that many health quote unquote experts have their own theories about how diet causes autism and ADHD and other bullshit like that, but we're not even going to get into that here for obvious reasons. But, well, to be fair, nutrition can help improve some of the more disabling aspects of neurodivergence, such as anxiety and depression, which have everything to do with the gut brain connection, which is why I created my cookbook, Nourishing Neurodiversity. I mean, there's no disputing that eating crap, and yes, I'm calling it crap while being highly aware of that term, but just for the sake of not having to over explain myself, which I am already doing right now, wow, but you guys know what I mean when I say crap or junk food, because if you've read any of my books, you know that I believe all foods fit, and I myself eat plenty of quote unquote crap and junk food, but I also trust my body to balance it out with more nutrient dense foods. Anyways, again, whole nother rabbit hole that we're not going to get into. But now that I've mentioned my cookbook, I'm going to put in a shameless plug here once again to check it out. In fact, do go check out all of my books at livelabelfreebooks.com. And now, back to today's topic. So, it's no rocket science that the autistic brain processes more stimuli more intensely, which means it also uses more energy. So, yes, that means it burns more calories compared to neurotypical brains. And there have been scientific studies on this, as I shared in my podcast a while back on autism, anorexia, and metabolism. Although it's worth putting a large footnote here that the research is significantly lacking and is, no surprise, incredibly biased towards males because, again, people across the entire gender spectrum are being left out. It's this heightened sensory processing that leads to an overstimulated brain. Merging this with what I said earlier about adequate energy, because all of the brain's resources are being directed towards dealing with the bombardment of stimulation, there's simply no energy left for other tasks, including social interactions, executive function, and even digestion. So, no surprise that most neurodivergent people experience challenges in these areas. Add the trauma of disordered eating to the mix, and, well, I'm sure you have your own lived experience to calculate the results of this complex equation. When your body and mind are overwhelmed in every way possible, we seek that escape I mentioned earlier. People who present with restrictive eating disorders such as anorexia or ARFID will avoid food, adhere to rituals and routines, fidget excessively, engage in compulsive movement, and isolate themselves. Someone who isn't familiar with neurodivergence may hear these behaviors and think, clear signs of an eating disorder. But if you are even the slightest bit familiar with my work and my approach, you know that one of the greatest dangers of traditional eating disorder treatment models is that they completely misunderstand the fact that in autistic people, the quote unquote ED behaviors are merely a manifestation of the autistic traits. And if there's also ADHD in the mix, the ED behaviors are a manifestation of that as well, which is, of course, what we're talking about today. In my recent podcast episode titled, Is It Harder for an Autistic Person to Recover?, in which I debunk 3 myths about autism and eating disorders, I talked about how there's this belief that you can't diagnose someone with autism, or ADHD for that matter, when they have active anorexia, because supposedly anorexia behaviors mimic autistic traits. So, like I just said, these may include strict adherence to rituals and routines, compulsive pacing or other exercise, excessive fidgeting like leg bouncing, and I'm sure you have many more examples coming up right now because there just are so many. And I'm sure that I do not have to repeat that this claim that you can't diagnose neurodivergence in someone with an active eating disorder is problematic for so many reasons. Because the obvious implication of this belief is that we're not even going to consider the person as autistic until they're quote unquote recovered from anorexia, which, as we all know, the medical people equate to being weight restored. They claim that the person will magically start thinking clearly once they're no longer starving. But this logic is so twisted. Why? Because they somehow forget the fact that someone developed the eating adaptation before they were already starving, meaning that the starving brain is not necessarily the driver of anorexia. I mean, someone decided to diet or exercise or what have you because they needed a way to feel safe in the world. See how it's an adaptation? They adapted their behaviors to reduce overwhelm. What makes the medical people's weight gain needs to come before the mental work can start logic even more twisted is that an individual actually needs to address the underlying fears and root causes in order to start accepting weight gain. I mean, how do we expect someone to even begin doing this when we aren't acknowledging the possibility of underlying autism and or ADHD and any other conditions for that matter? This is awareness that could allow us to make accommodations to help the individual reach a point where their brain does start functioning better, state of nutrition aside. Well, here comes the plot twist, my friend, which circles back to the claim that anorexia helps me focus. The plot twist is that many people with eating disorders secretly don't want their brain to start functioning better. Why? Because a healthy brain for us autistic and ADHD folks means a brain that's overwhelming. A brain that's constantly asking those existential questions. A brain that's constantly confronted with awareness itself. And if you listened to my spontaneous Go on a Walk with Me episode in August 2025, you may remember my sharing of my experience with this confrontation with consciousness as existential nausea. When your sole focus is food, and in a way, the eating disorder is almost serving as an autistic special interest, you don't have the mental capacity to think about anything else. You're numbed from the existential questioning because anorexia creates the ultimate answer to everything. You don't have to face the responsibilities that come with being healthy, or if we go further, being a meaningful member of society. You don't have to face your own vastness and creative potential. And what about all those ADHD bouncing balls in your head? Well, because there's not enough energy in the brain, the bouncing balls can't bounce as high or as fast. When we view the eating disorder from this perspective, wow, how adaptive that someone with ADHD and or autism would develop anorexia. Of course, this isn't to say that starving yourself is a positive adaptation. When an adaptation becomes maladaptive, that is to say, it hinders your ability to lead an authentic life, the behaviors are no longer sustainable. Even more than that, they're destructive to both the individual and everyone around them. Because I'm obviously not here to promote restriction. I mean, there's a reason I chose to recover. My mission here is to help you understand why you or your loved one may feel so addicted to the eating disorder so that you can create your own why for leading a meaningful life. So, in a nutshell, anorexia is addictive because it's the tried and true method of transcendence. It's a way to distract yourself from physical reality, to quiet the constant autistic and ADHD noise that can be so goddamn overwhelming. Trust me, I know, because I experience that noise all day and night long, my friend. I dread going to sleep due to that confrontation with consciousness, and even when I'm sleeping, I have all the thoughts. I don't know about you, my friend, but I have very intense dreams, and a lot of neurodivergent people I speak to say the same thing. I find this very fascinating because, no joke, I literally did not dream when I had an eating disorder. And now that I think about it, it's probably because my brain was just too tired to come up with stories. Wait, let me rephrase that, because if you've read How to Get Out of Quasi Recovery, you know that that entire book is about the whole idea of the eating disorder and the in recovery identity being stories in and of themselves. And the power in acknowledging this is that it creates space for writing a new story, the story you actually want to be part of. So, if you haven't yet read How to Get Out of Quasi Recovery or listened to the audiobook, because it's available in all formats, and of course, the audiobook is narrated by me. If you haven't yet consumed the book in whatever capacity, do grab yourself a copy at livelabelfreebooks.com or on Amazon, and while you're at it, grab the Discovery Workbook as well that helps you implement what you learn in the main book. So now going back to the dream thing, because my entire body, so including my physical brain, was operating in survival mode during anorexia, when I woke up, I just hadn't dreamt of anything. But on the rare occasion that I did dream, it was almost always a nightmare of me eating food that wasn't allowed, or it was me not being able to go on my run because my parents had a court order placed on me to force me into treatment, and other horrific stories like that. Those were literally my dreams. And I actually did wake up once at 3 a.m. sweating and having heart palpitations because I had dreamt about eating an entire kilogram bag of pepernoten, which are Dutch spice cookies, and they are so good. But oh my god, me eating that entire bag in my dream, or rather nightmare, it had felt so real. And of course, that's what made the extreme hunger, when it actually was real, and I did go through extreme hunger, that's what made it so terrifying, because my binge nightmares had literally become a reality. And if you want to read more about my experience with this, do grab a copy of my book, How to Beat Extreme Hunger, which, by the way, now that I've mentioned all my books anyways, you can actually get a bundle discount when you buy them all directly from my website, livelabelfreebooks.com, so go do that if you're curious. And it's just a nice way to support me, because all this podcast, everything I do here is free, and my books are my art. So, anyways, now that we are talking about hunger, I feel like it just makes sense to talk about another ADHD and anorexia link, which is hyperfocus. And we are specifically going to be talking about hyperfocus on food, which is basically mental hunger, right? And oh my god, the restriction high. Because hello, dopamine. And if you're listening to this, chances are you know what mental hunger is. But just in case you are new here or you are a caregiver and are like, wait, what? Let me briefly explain. So, mental hunger is exactly what it sounds like. It's being hungry and having your hunger cues be mental. It's constantly thinking about food. It's mentally counting calories, shifting food items around in your mind to create the perfect balance. And thinking about exercise all the time can be a form of mental hunger too if you're wanting to move more so you feel less guilty about eating. One of the biggest fears I had, and one of the biggest fears of my clients, is that mental hunger is just a bad habit, like a negative thought loop you've conditioned yourself to be stuck in. They fear that giving into their mental hunger will make them an emotional eater, and oh no, we don't want that, right? So instead of surrendering to our body's innate wisdom, we micromanage our food and exercise habits and tell ourselves the story that we can't be trusted. But again, that's all it is, a story. And this is why, in my courses and coaching programs, we really dive deep into the stories you're telling yourself and the limiting beliefs you are convinced are the absolute truth. Because the real truth is that your biggest fears are just lies. Sure, they're protecting you, but they're equally shielding you from living the life that you know in your heart you are capable of living. Got questions about extreme hunger? Well, I've got answers. More specifically, I answer the top 10 most frequently asked questions about extreme hunger in my completely free Extreme Hunger Guide. Some of the questions I answer are: what to do if you experience extreme hunger when you're already weight restored? How to tell if it's mental hunger or emotional eating? What's the difference between extreme hunger and binge eating disorder? And of course, 7 other common questions. Grab your free guide at livelabelfree.com/extreme-hunger-guide. So that's livelabelfree, like the name of this podcast, .com/extreme-hunger-guide. And now, let's get back to today's episode. As autistic, ADHD, and or ADHD people, we want to have a special interest. We want to hyperfocus. It's how we channel our energy, the way we transcend this shallow world and enter our own creative dimension. As I write in How to Get Out of Quasi-Recovery, I believe we are all artists. That is why we are on this planet, to create art so we can connect and contribute. But of course, this is also where the possibility of failure comes in. Because how do you know that your unique creations won't be judged and shamed? How do you know people will even like you? There's no proof because, well, welcome to life. So what do? You adapt. You pick a hyper-focus that's predictable. And well, welcome to eating disorder land, and later on, the land of quasi-recovery. So, how do we break free then? How on earth can you recover when your hyperfocus is food? Well, first, we must acknowledge that restriction is going to make you hyperfocus on food whether you are neurodivergent or not. This doesn't make you special, it just makes you a mammal whose only priority is survival. The brain obsesses over what it can't have, which is why you spend your days dreaming about food while not trusting yourself to actually eat enough of it. And in my book, How to Get Out of Quasi-Recovery, I actually share an anecdote about water in Bali, and if you are one of my one-on-one clients, and I may have mentioned this in an existential autistic membership call as well, and by the way, if you do join the membership, you get instant access to all of our previously recorded calls, which are a lot at this point. And I mean, the membership is super affordable. You get direct access to me, you get the opportunity to ask all your questions and share your struggles and literally get one-on-one coaching from me and like a few other people. Because it's also a pretty small group. Like a lot of people, when they join, they're surprised that there's not like 50, 100 people in there. There's literally only like 4 to 5 people on the call every week, which makes it super intimate so that you do get the attention and time and care and all of that you deserve. But anyways, that was a tangent because I love the weekly membership calls, so I would really love it if you joined us, which again, you can do at livelabelfree.com/membership. But back to what I was saying about the water in Bali story. I have shared this story quite a few times, so many times that I just can't remember where and when and how, but I do know that I talk about it in How to Get Out of Quasi-Recovery to illustrate, why mental hunger isn't just a quote-unquote bad habit and you're not addicted to thinking about food. You literally think about food all the time because food is scarce. Your survival is threatened because there's not enough food around. So when I was in Bali, I was really paranoid about clean drinking water because if you've ever been to Bali or you know any of those countries like India, Bali, other Indonesian countries, like a lot of countries in Asia, probably also in South America and just other countries that are not, rich, let's say, um, you cannot drink water there from the tap because the water is super polluted, and if you drink it, you will literally get like food poisoning, I guess water poisoning, and I got food poisoning there, which was the most painful experience of my entire life. But that's a whole other story. When I was in Bali, I was paranoid about clean drinking water because there wasn't, abundance of it. I had to go to the store to get water, which means the store had to be open, which means that if I was going to bed and I didn't have water, I would literally dehydrate. So I was always checking, that I had clean drinking water with me. The moment I woke up, I would check that there was enough clean drinking water. Whenever I'd go to bed, I would check that there's enough clean drinking water. Like I would think about water the entire day and I would think about not getting food poisoning. So I was, pretty hyper focused on my survival at the time. I was pretty hyper focused on making sure that food and water were abundant. I mean, safe food and water were abundant because, I mean, there's plenty of food in Bali, but a lot of it is not very safe. And yeah, and even despite that, even despite me being so paranoid, being so attentive to details, I still got food poisoning there. So yeah, anyways, the reason I share this story is because when it came to the water, I was obsessed with thinking about water. But when I came back home, when I came back to the Netherlands, and all the time that I'm living anywhere where, you can just drink water from the tap, I am not thinking about water at all, right? I only think about water when I'm thirsty. I only think about water when I'm dehydrated, which is the same thing as thirsty. I only think about water when I'm leaving the house for an extended period of time, so I want to make sure I have my water bottle with me. Like the only times I think about water is when I need to think about water. And that's the same with me and food. Like, yeah, I think about food, I need to plan my groceries, I need to plan my meals, etc. But I am not thinking about food the entire fucking day, right? Because I'm not malnourished, because my body doesn't sense scarcity around food. So, moral of the story is that when you prove abundance to your body and brain, you simply have no reason to hyper-focus on food. And I know that might sound unimaginable, especially because you are probably listening to this while simultaneously planning what you're going to eat next, or you're simultaneously planning how you're going to balance out what you just ate, whatever it is. But my clients and I, we are living proof that you can fully recover and you can fill your life with true meaning and purpose. You can fully recover, or should I say, discover your gifts. And yes, even you can use your gifts to help others. And on that, I know that that feels a lot like pressure. And one of the existential autistic membership calls we did a while ago was literally this topic, when giftedness feels like pressure, how do you handle that? So this is all part of the meaningful suffering that I talk about in my books and on the membership calls and in my coaching. This is all part of creating a life that's worth suffering for. Because, yes, I believe that as neurodivergent people, especially, the human condition is suffering. There is not a day goes by that I do not feel trapped in this body, that I do not feel held back, painfully held back by physical constraints, whether this be time, whether this be my energy, whether this be literally my physical flesh and bones that my soul is inside. You know, every single day is really hard for me. And I think for me also writing and, scripting podcast episodes and doing all of this, it is actually really painful for me because words will always fail. No matter what words I use, no matter what I say, I will never, ever, ever be able to express myself in exactly the way that my soul, my essence, my being communicates. And that's really, yeah, that's really hard to accept. And honestly, I refuse to accept it because, yeah, for obvious reasons. Again, I can't find the words right now, but I trust that if you're listening to this, you, either feel the same way or you understand or at least can comprehend what I'm saying to some capacity. So that being said, every day for me is suffering, so to say, but the suffering is worth it because I get to connect with you. I get to impact you. I get to inspire you. I get to support you. I get to empower you. That is the only reason I do all of this because I want to help other people feel connected to themselves, feel connected to others, feel connected to me. I want to connect and contribute. That is why I was put on this planet. That is why you were put on this planet. So again, that is this idea of creating a life worth suffering for. However, an eating disorder is also suffering, but you're not suffering for anything. You're suffering to create more suffering, to create more misery, to create a life that isn't even a life, because you're not even living. You're just fucking surviving, right? So, why don't we, take the leap and the trust fall into the void? Why don't we recover or discover? Well, it's because we feel like we need proof first. We want to know the outcome, right? We want to guarantee. So if you're listening to this and are like, no, but I need proof first. I need to know for certain that I won't swing to the other side if I honor my mental hunger. If you were thinking all of these things, if you were staying stuck in quasi-recovery, not because you don't want to recover, but because you are terrified of the emptiness and the void of who you'll be, please do yourself a favor and grab a copy of my books, How to Beat Extreme Hunger and How to Get Out of Quasi-Recovery, and the accompanying discovery workbook, of course, because literally the first chapter of my quasi-recovery book is titled Knowledge, and the discovery workbook helps you create a life where you are living on purpose. And to be clear here, this isn't about finding a replacement for your eating disorder, because, to quote my book, How to Get Out of Quasi-Recovery, the eating disorder is nothing but emptiness itself. So rather, this is about creating a life that you don't need to escape from, because again, that is what the eating disorder is. It is nothing but an escape. It is nothing but a giant fucking distraction from your true self because you are so terrified of who you truly are. And by the way, if you've already read my books and have completed the exercises in the workbook and you still feel stuck, well then please schedule a discovery call for one-on-one coaching to receive support directly from me, or if you need a more affordable option, of course there's my Extreme Hunger course, Extremely Hungry to Completely Satisfied, and there's of course the Existential Autistic Membership, and there's also the Autistically AD-Free Academy, which I do only open once or twice a year, so you can get on the wait list for that at livelabelfree.com/group, and you can find all the other links and information on my website, livelabelfree.com. So yeah, all that being said, damn, we have covered a lot so far, and now that we have covered everything we just did, it's time to move on to another really important connector of ADHD, autism, and anorexia, which is, drumroll please, exercise. Because, oh my lordy, this was a big part of my eating adaptation, And it is for most of my clients, and I'm guessing if you're listening to this, it probably is for you, or if you're listening to this at a caregiver, as a caregiver, it's probably a very big part of your loved one's eating adaptation as well. And I think we can all know, or at least imagine, that exercise is so misunderstood in eating disorder treatment. I mean, one of my clients even told me that she got reprimanded for bouncing her leg while sitting. I mean, what the actual fuck? Anyways, it is so important to understand how compulsive movement, or as you may know from me at this point, I like to call it adaptive movement because it completely changes the game for eating disorder discovery. So, I do have multiple chapters on exercise in my quasi recovery book, no surprise, of course, and I have done 2 previous podcast episodes on exercise addiction. So I am just going to jump straight into the connection to ADHD and autism now. So, the first thing that's coming to mind for me right now is how exercise is one of the top recommendations for improving ADHD symptoms, or rather traits, because symptoms is pathological and we do not pathologize here, right? So, why is exercise recommended for people with ADHD? Well, because we all know that exercise releases dopamine, and my theory is that the exercise addiction in anorexia is just a form of self medicating. When you compound this with the hypervigilance, so being in constant fight or flight mode due to being neurodivergent, exercise is a way to release that energy. It's a form of stimming, which is short for self stimulatory behavior, or as I prefer to call it, self regulatory behavior, because that's the entire point of it, right? To regulate your nervous system. During my eating disorder, the running and the push ups and the HIIT workouts and everything in between, they were never about weight loss or trying to burn calories. The intensity was a biological drive to release stress, and the strict adherence to distances and times and sets and reps, it was all to maintain predictability and routine. When I was forced into eating disorder treatment, I did secret exercises in the bathroom, and even these were not truly ED behaviors. The secret exercises were literally just my PDA, so pervasive drive for autonomy, because I wasn't gonna let anyone tell me what I could or couldn't do. And now that I'm saying this, I'm reminded that I have a free audio training called 3 Steps to Recovery from an Eating Disorder as an Autistic Person. So, in that training, you will learn how to use your autistic traits to your advantage in eating disorder recovery. So, if you are struggling with anything that I have ever mentioned on this podcast, if you feel like autism is a barrier to your discovery journey, if you feel like being autistic is making it harder to recover from an eating disorder, definitely go listen to my free audio training, and you can find it on my website, livelabelfree.com. There are some really practical steps in there. I mean, it's not just me lecturing or speaking. It's literally like I ask you to stop and pause and do exercises and take action on things. And it's about an hour long, so it's literally like having a free coaching session with me on demand. So definitely do go check that out if you have not listened to it yet. And oh my god, this is probably one of the longest solo episodes I have ever done. And you bet I'm going to be using some of the information I share in here in the book I'm currently writing about anorexia and autism, because my time is valuable. And honestly, what a waste if I don't repurpose this. But that's just me, because I am always optimizing, just like I know you are, my friend. Anyways, I do hope you loved this episode. I hope you got a lot out of it. And if you did, please leave a positive rating and review for the Live Label Free podcast. Or if you're listening on YouTube, do subscribe and like and do all the things, because it's a completely free way to support my work and helps other people find the show. And of course, if you want more help on your discovery journey, head over to my website, livelabelfree.com, where you can buy my books, join my courses and the membership, and of course, you can work with me privately. I hope to talk to you soon in real time, and otherwise, I'll be back in your ears for the next episode. Bye-bye for now. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast, my friend. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean so much to me if you could leave a positive rating and review for the Live Label Free podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It's a free way to show your support so I can continue bringing you the valuable content that I love to create for you.